This is the third in the reflections on the Dante T.S. Eliot course. Today I'll reflect on the third of the Commedia, which is the Paradiso. I'm going to entitle this, though, The Culture Wars, Dante and Paradiso. One of the dilemmas we face today in the larger cultural or civilizational wars, and this has a long history itself, is a certain demeaning, a certain trashing, a certain undermining, a certain canceling of Christianity as a significant force within Western and Eastern civilizations, for that matter. What often happens by those who want to cancel Christianity, they take negative stories and they pile negativity upon negativity as if that explains a far more comprehensive understanding of a way of thinking and of being that created a civilization, the great works of art and music and philosophy and theology and education and hospitals and what else. The great civilization of the West at its noblest and best comes out of a certain theological, philosophical way of thinking. But there's a history that has brought this into being, that has brought us where we are today, in which Christianity tends to be the major target that's shot at amongst certain progressives. And so, where does this come from, though? What's a bit of a history of the culture wars? Because culture wars are not new. They're as old as humans have existed and have tried to interpret their world, their religion, their cultures, their civilizations, and people differ in those interpretations. In fact, what Dante's doing in the Paradiso, he's essentially arguing that all our interpretations are finite, they're fallible, they're relative, and so be careful of absolutizing our own interpretations and then turning on others because they differ with our particular read of ultimate reality, a penultimate reality, or anti-penultimate reality. But the culture wars, where does this history come from, in which increasingly so we've lost any sense of what the Western civilization is about at a theological, a philosophical, a political, a cultural, a literary, an artistic, painting and music? What's the history of the unfurling of this particular ethos? I think there's various phases of which this drama unfolds. One obviously would be the fragmentation in the Middle Ages between Western Christianity and Eastern Christianity, or Orthodoxy and Roman Catholicism at the time. And both of them, for different reasons, disputed, differed, fragmented ecclesially on certain reads of who God is, what we can know about God, what we cannot know about God, and what the impact that has on liturgy, ecclesiology, views of the church, and whatnot. But at least at this period of time, historically, there was a sense, there was Christendom, there was civilization, there was a great deal shared about history. The Middle Ages referred back to the patristic era of the great theologians of Clement and Origen in the East, Chrysostom and Basil, Gregory of Nazianzen and Nyssa in the West, Jerome, Augustine. You had the women played very significant roles, Macrina, certainly as we hit the Middle Ages, Hildegard, key figure in all of this. There's many women, or abbas or ammas as we would call them in this story, but they shared metaphors, images, stories, history, that they collectively knew as a people. They could differ on how they were interpreted, but at least there was the story that they all shared in that unfolding drama. The coming to be of the Reformation of the 16th century, what gradually happened was, increasingly so with Luther, and then more so with Calvin and the Anabaptists, there was the sense that tradition or the history was problematic, and we had to get back to the Bible, sola scriptura. And so with a tendency to pit Bible against tradition, there was the sense of 1,500 years of history, of theology, philosophy, arts, culture, civilization, education. As this was very secondary or tertiary to knowing the Bible, knowing how to read the Bible, how to exegete the Bible. And so what's beginning to happen in the 16th century, Luther less so than Calvin, and the Anabaptists even more so than the Reformed Calvinist tradition, there's a sense that history itself of Christianity and tradition itself is the problem, and one has to get back to the Bible, because the Bible's the pure source of a truth, and is interpreted properly, it articulates how one is to live, the self, society, the church, and whatnot. And so here we're beginning to get a split in Western civilization between the Bible and tradition or history. As that begins, so already it's Christianity that is creating its own unfolding, its own deterioration, its own dissension, its own implosion in that sense. And so to blame what's coming to be what's called the Enlightenment on one hand and French Revolution on the other, what the French Revolution essentially did was what the Reformation did, only secularized it. What they essentially argued is that a form of secular liberalism was the new Bible, and the rest of history could not be counted on whatsoever. So all it is, it just changed the sources of authority. It elevated one source of authority, a certain notion of secular liberalism, that humans in and of themselves could create a better world against the Dark Ages that had preceded it, elements of the church which had been agents of injustice in some ways. And then there was the Enlightenment tradition, which was not as graphically brutal as elements of the French Revolution. And it's the idea there was, you get it in Hegel and other thinkers, the notion of the history is dialectically ever moving forward. So if history is the process of moving forward through a thesis, antithesis, synthesis to a better world, then that which has come before is always a lower level of knowing, a lower level of being, a lower level of civilization. And so we are on the cusp of the wave into the future. And so why then is the past all that significant other than a memory of what to avoid in terms of negative stories? So you get on the one hand the French Revolution, which is the secularizing of the Protestant Reformation in many ways, in terms of both have a certain suspicion of the Roman Catholic past, and most don't have any understanding much at all of the Orthodox or Eastern Christianity. And then the Enlightenment itself, particularly what we would call the centrist or right wing of the Enlightenment, saw history as progressing ever forward, and that was the nature of 19th century liberal progressivism, which was really in many ways undermined by World War I, World War II, and much that happened between those wars as well. And so when we think then of Dante, there is this tendency for most people today, when asked, first of all, what do you know about the past? There's virtually nothing. So this is, in some sense, the sadness, the civilization sadness of memoricide, no memory anymore. And then this negative interpretation, largely, of Christianity and Western civilization, which is a part of it. So progressives will tendency to pick and choose very selectively, usually lines totally out of context of great writers, and say that's what the Greeks thought, that's what the Romans thought, that's what Christians thought, which of course is very silly. And most of them have no substantive understanding of the past in any even minimal way. Their understanding is probably kindergarten in that sense, but they take lines or two, and sadly, so this is called educated way of appropriating, interpreting, understanding the past. So when we get to Dante then, to someone like Dante, I've talked to many people who have PhDs, they have backgrounds in philosophy and theology and culture, and you ask them, do you know the Commedia? Have you read the Commedia? Well, there's nothing at all in their memory banks at all, and a minimal understanding, and yet the Commedia is a great roadmap in terms of human meaning, human understanding, from the Inferno through the Purgatorio into the Paradiso, and also Dante's other works, like his work on monarchy and Convivio, and these other works. And so people often are trashing, undermining a civilization they know nothing about, and it's only this negativity piling on negativity. So and then what happens, of course, when people have no memory, then how do they orient? How does a people orient with all the landmarks gone, all the signals gone? Well, it's quite understandable why we're in a state of cultural fragmentation and chaos at the present time when it comes to identity politics, because people have no grounding to even know where you start discussion. And if the past is the wisdom of the past is totally dismissed, then of course people are totally disoriented on what paths to take, what trails they should trek in terms of moving forward on their all too human journey in that sense. Now, what Dante's doing in the Commedia, he's attempting to summarize the very fullness of Western civilization, and often there's Eastern tucked into some of this as well. And so you get this great summary of choices made, consequences of choices, and then what's the best way to move forward in terms of a more meaningful life. And so it's almost a ladder, it's in a ladder of ascent from the Inferno to the Purgatorio up through the Paradiso itself. One thing he's getting at, which is very valuable for our cancel culture at the present time, he makes it clear, for example, in Cantos 10 to 12, there were those who were at odds with one another philosophically and theologically in time. Thomas à Kempis, C.J. Bevand. They turned on one another, they critiqued one another, and so the first 12, as it were, as you're moving through Cantos 10 to 12, they turned on whether they were involved in their own sort of cancel culture at the time, polarization at their time, in time in history. Some of them were valorized, others were demeaned. But when they get into the Paradiso, in fact, what they do is they become the best of friends. They're very attentive to one another. They listen to one another. They realize that both in their own way had imperfections. They were finite. This is why humility is one of the key virtues that Dante's attempting to articulate in the Commedia itself. That we are all finite, fallible, which means we see, as St. Paul would say, through a glass darkly. None of us has access to absolute, infinite truth. And of course, as we go through the Paradiso, increasingly so, the sheer mystery and the fullness of reality opens up to Dante as he's led step by step on his journey. But from Cantos 10 to 12, in the Paradiso, people are brought in who are at odds with one another within the Christian tradition. And so when we hit Canto 12, the Franciscans and Dominicans, which historically is friars, which critique the monastic tradition, we get Thomas Aquinas and Dominic, which were Dominicans in time. They at times were going at the Franciscans, of, in this case, Francis and Bonaventura. But when they get into the Paradiso, this is a different world entirely. The fragmentation, the desperate approaches, the misreads of one another, all of a sudden the greater unity emerges, and they both see, as they in the Paradiso, all these significant thinkers have much more in common, and they also realize that in fact their interpretation of ultimate issues in penultimate ways had gone astray in various ways, and they desperately needed one another to complement their own misperceptions of reality, both in thought and word and in deed. And so this greater unity is emerging the higher up one goes in the Paradiso, the ladder of ascent in terms of understanding and perception and forgiveness. People are overcoming decisions made, polarization at lower level, realizing that the more one ascends from the Inferno through the Purgatorio to the Paradiso, in fact, that unity, and this is why for Dante, love is at the very highest, and love in the classical sense is about unity. What is that which increasingly brings us together versus that which keeps us separate, isolated, polarized, at odds with one another? And we can see in the Paradiso, in one sense, at a philosophical level, or what we call an epistemological level, the critique of an approach to reality in which people think they have the absolute truth, and others who differ with them, they're often at odds with, and it become very verbally confrontational, and worst case scenario, a military way as well, and the tragedy that emerges from that. As we move higher up the Paradiso, we can see the bigger questions often asked, which emerges in the Inferno, is why would someone from a classical tradition, not an explicitly Christian tradition, be leading Dante on his journey? For he is not explicitly a Christian in any way. Why wouldn't we bring in some great Christian thinker who could illuminate for Dante, his journey. And Virgil's chosen takes him through, obviously, the Inferno into the Purgatorio. The question that often emerges, which is the bigger one from that, what happens to people who were not exposed to Christianity as it emerged, knew nothing about Christianity or Christ or the church? And what happens to those people? Are they resigned to limbo? Or within certain forms of Christianity, if they haven't accepted Christ in this time, it's eternal punishment. That's not how Dante thought in any way. It's truly Catholic thinking, or kataholos. It's very interesting that the dominant metaphor in Canto 20 is the eagle. The eagle is the one who has the spacious, who's in flight, who has the spacious view and has the eagle eye to see the big landscape over which he is flying. So the philosophical or theological eagle becomes a dominant metaphor for Dante as one moves up the Purgatorio. And it's fascinating when one moves from Canto 10 to 12 up to Canto 20, that the political people are the ones who were at odds in time in history. Dante just doesn't choose from biblical political leaders like David or Hezekiah. He's also drawing from important Christian emperors like Constantine, but also Roman emperors who had no knowledge of Christianity, but they were agents of justice. They were keenly committed to peacemaking and justice, and even though they were not explicitly Christian in any significant sense, they embodied in their lives at the level of ruling at a political level agents of justice, and out of justice then just peacemaking in that sense. So in Canto 20, you get key figures who were significant political leaders, some biblical, some Christian emperors, and other non-Christian emperors. And they're even higher up than the theologians and the philosophers for the simple reason that they're agents of bringing together a good political order, a good commonweal, a good common good that was about justice. And where justice prevails, then peacemaking at its best is the unfolding and consequence of such an organization. And so Dante has a little lower down those who only think about important issues, but those who think about them and then act on them are a little higher on the ladder of ascent. And it's the eagle who sees all this. So there's various images and metaphors which are used in this story by Dante in the ascent into the Paradiso in that sense. And so the ascent in the Paradiso, we move from Virgil, who stepped back at a certain point. Beatrice is always the key figure in the Commedia. How are we to read Beatrice? The literal Beatrice, Beatrice as wisdom, Beatrice as the church. Beatrice can be interpreted in a multiplicity of ways, but she's an agent of grace for Dante on his journey. And what Dante is getting at is that often we do not on our journey have some immediate experience, interpretation of the divine or grace in our life. It's mediated through people. So rather than immediate grace, it's mediated through people. And Beatrice for Dante becomes a key figure of mediated grace, just as Virgil was a form of mediated grace. Just as finally, as we move through St. Bernard of Clairvaux, who is the, again, mediated grace that opens up the divine and the beatific vision, in which there's a dynamic view of reality. It comes to Dante. And so Dante's given this huge vision of what makes life meaningful, the human journey. He's still obviously alive. And so this is what the Commedia is about, is someone who's offered the opportunity in their life to see how choices are made, not only in their own life, because much of the journey of Dante is about his own journey, but also how others have made decisions. We can watch people we know close to us, others we don't know, decisions, how they can get themselves in a cesspool at times, how they can get themselves to cliff's edge, others who make meaningful decisions where that takes them on their journey. And so this eagle-type overview of the human journey in the Commedia offers a roadmap for people in terms of choices, consequences in thought, word, and deed, and where they lead in terms of the ends, and step by step, the way they understand their identity in that sense, and their journey. Very interesting to note that in the word repent, which is a key figure that will often come up in the Commedia. In Greek, it's metanoia, and metanoia means noia is Greek word from nous, and nous is the classical way of knowing or understanding being itself, or ontology is the word that's used here. And so sin, which can sometimes be focused on smaller ethical misdeeds and misdemeanors, when people at the various levels are called to repent, they're asked in many ways to think about the very understanding of their being and what it's directed towards in meaning. And repenting means change your understanding of yourself, desires, longings, thirsts, where we turn to fulfill those, and where are the other paths we could hike that take us to deeper wells in which the thirst of our soul can be slaked in a much, much more meaningful manner. And so the underlining these two key elements within the Commedia is the notion of sin, hamartia in the Greek sense, or pectum in Latin. Be careful of the arrows one pulls out of the quiver of their soul and how they shoot that arrow, but misses the mark of meaning. And underneath then, of course, that is the very notion of what does it mean to be? And this is where in Hamlet you get to be or not to be. This is the question. And so Dante, in that sense, anticipating what Shakespeare is doing in Hamlet, he's giving a much more nuanced understanding, also much more sense of mystery is at work in Dante's Divine Comedy, and say Milton's Paradise Lost, where he's going to attempt to articulate in this great work of literature to justify the ways of God to man, and much of the Paradise Lost is an attempt to unfold that. There's a humility in Dante that you don't quite find in the Puritan Milton in the same way. This is why T.S. Eliot, for example, in his work on Dante and his articles on Milton and Dante and Shakespeare, he sees Milton as a much more lesser thinker because for the simple reason he's trying to give answers to large issues, both ultimately and penultimately, that are more issues of mystery and ambiguity. But there are pointers, there are hints that we can have along the journey, but be careful of being too comprehensive, too exacting, too certain on such a journey. And so as one ascends in the Paradiso, in that sense, there is this dynamic mystery. The saints, the angels, they're shimmering with light. They're coming alive in a very, very different way than we would even know. And what's interesting in this story itself is the Beatrice that Dante thought he knew as a young man. The more he grows, the more he sees his teacher or his guide. There's far more to them. So the guide begins to unconceal even more. As it were, the student begins to mature. And so the Beatrice throughout the Commedia, he begins to see there's more and more and more to her that he wasn't even aware of, because he wasn't aware as a human being of some of the key issues. And we'll find this again and again in the Commedia. The people, and even in life, people we think we know, we really don't know that well because we don't know ourselves that well. Then how we perceive others, they're very much concealed from us on their journey, and we don't read them adequately. And then the more we begin to change, so the more Dante changes, the more he matures, the more he sees Beatrice, and all of a sudden she's this glorious figure like Galadriel in Lord of the Rings in many ways, and she emerges significantly more almost as an angelic being the further he goes along. And then Bernard at the end of the Commedia opens up even the bigger cosmos to Dante and what Christ is really like when transfigured. It's similarly out of the biblical story itself. One element to also reflect upon is Dante's working out a Ptolemaic universe, which of course is dated, in which the earth is the center of the universe. So at a scientific level, it's dated, but at a metaphorical or an allegorical level, what the medievals were doing, they understood the planets were almost forms of character types or personality types, similar to what you get in the Enneagram today. So each of the planets, as Dante goes higher and higher, beginning with the moon, the first three really are still in the world of shadows, even though in paradise they're still in the world of shadows. But the light is emerging more and more, just as in the beginning of a new day, you move from the darkness early morning through dawn, through the light of the day. And so the people who are on moon, for example, they're very unstable in many ways, but they've moved from Inferno, Purgatorio. They often follow the whims of any given moment. So they can start their day with the sense they'd like to do. Some little bird whistles, and they follow that little bird. Another little bird whistles, they follow that. What we call faffing today. And so there are people temperamentally that are often not good intentions, wonderful heart, but not focused, not directed. And then you move, obviously, one plant is people much more militant in their thinking, much more focused, and yet one has to be a little careful of being too focused, too militant in one's tendencies, too sure of oneself. Venus, the planet of love, a person who's driven by their passions, their hungers, their thirsts, and by the time we get to the Paradiso, obviously that is being disciplined, it's being controlled, but still they're having to deal with those issues. And so the planets that Dante is using in the Paradiso are really just temperament types, and each person is given distinctive temperament types, and they both have pros and cons to them. There's good in certain temperament types, but there's also the downside in temperament types. And as one moves through the Inferno, through the Purgatorio to the Paradiso, the downside or the shadow of the temperament type is increasingly being refined. And as Dante had to go through the fire earlier, he had to deal with the downsides of his temperament, and it had to be purged, it had to be cleaned up, and the good of it really emerged, the maturing side emerged. And so as we come to the end of the Purgatorio and the Commedia, and we move into T.S. Eliot, which will be number 4, this journey it's a highly complex one for Dante, but it's a roadmap of meaning and significant to understand. It's a commedia too. As I mentioned in my first lecture, a commedia takes the notion that where appropriate, meaningful decisions are made, there will be a good ending, similar to Lord of the Rings. That's a commedia. Chronicles of Narnia are a commedia. Harry Potter is a commedia. They're working out of the comedic tradition. There will be struggles. There will be a person has to face themselves. They have to face interpersonal, familial issues, political issues, economic issues in our day, ecological issues. But where the battle is fought, the agon, the agony is done, it will end well. That's a commedia. Now, the other genre of life in literature is the tragedy, but a lot of epic stories that we see in the theater today and in books are deeply indebted to Dante's comedic approach, which is obviously emerges earlier than him as a genre. But he does offer pathways for those who, if meaningful decisions are made, hopefully, of course, hope is one of those great virtues itself, faith, hope, and love. Hopefully the end will be more meaningful than if lesser choices are made, choices that more pander to the vices. And so Dante has brought together the great classical understanding of the virtues, vices, but also the Christian notion of the Beatitudes. And so where the Beatitudes walk hands with the classical virtues and vices, the ascent is made through the Purgatorio and then into the Paradiso. And then we'll pick up in the next 3 how T.S. Eliot dipped his bucket very deeply into the well of Dante. He did a little book on Dante, but he wrote also extensively about Dante and many other works as well.